got myself squarely in that. So that was fun. I like that transition that you described, Pella, from the sort of the future to a chosen future, to be thinking about that, because that's closely tied to what I was thinking about this week when I chose the topic of Utopia to talk about. I had wanted to build on what we talked about last week, which if you were here, if you remember, was calling on Kropotkin's phrase, pointing out that we are rich, that we have lots of technology, lots of possibilities, lots of wealth that other generations could never have dreamed of, that our problems are how we distribute that wealth, how we get it to people. The question, he said, right, is why are there so many poor when we have so much wealth? And so that got me thinking about utopia, about what it takes to imagine a new world, a different world, a way that we might live differently. Because that's a whole style of literature. It's a whole kind of stories. Sometimes they're in songs, a number of different ways that it comes about. But I was noticing that for all of the talk and activism and so on that we see today, I couldn't think of much that was utopian in nature, where people are putting out utopian TV shows or utopian novels or things like that. Now, maybe it's out there, I'm sure it's somewhere, but it's certainly not breaking into our consciousness in the way we might expect when people are out protesting and trying to make changes. So at the moment, I think utopian thinking is difficult because we are so cynical, right? We have a tendency to believe that the past controls us, that what we're seeing now in 2020 is 1968 being played out all over again. On one hand, it gives you a roadmap, it helps you understand it, you make some sense of it. But on the other hand, you turn around and say, that's just going to work out exactly the same way. We're right back where we started. Or if we want to think about the pandemic in similar terms, right? There have been lots of comparisons to the flu pandemic at the beginning of the last century. But of course, then we're back to that same sort of fatalism, right? That same turning back around, that having a difficult time seeing how this time we change things and they work out differently. Of course, in a Christian understanding of the universe, there's a guarantee, right? We know that there will be a new world coming because God will make it happen. So the claim that I'm sure we've all heard, right? The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? We know that it'll work out. That kind of metaphysical guarantee makes it possible to have a sort of hope, right? To hold on to it even when you can't see, even when you can't really clearly imagine what a utopia might look like, right? You're able to hold on to it. But that kind of hope's not available to humanists. From a humanistic perspective, what we see are the patterns repeating themselves. What we see is history, reenacting the same sort of thing again, of human nature and human failings, continuing to fail us. When there are revolutions, right, the power just reasserts itself. That's what we see when we look around the world. Utopian thinking was a common brand of thinking around the Enlightenment in Europe. The Enlightenment roughly comes around the French Revolution. It's sort of the ideas that drove it and the kinds of things that happened afterwards. And part of what happened is people started writing these utopias. They started generating these ideas of what the world would look like or could look like in the future. Because what they had done was break off from the traditions of the past. In France anyway, right, they executed the king. In England, they didn't go quite that far and they were never quite as utopian, although there certainly were people that wanted to. But the symbolism of that, of saying we're going to cut this off, we're going to end what was done before, and we're capable of recreating a new world, generated a whole bunch of utopian thinking. William Morris is probably one that you might know. People still sell his patterns. You can see them around here or there, but he's got a wonderful novel called The News from Nowhere. One of the first utopian novels out there, where he's writing about the future that he sees and presenting what it would look like when we reclaim sort of the arts and crafts tendency that we had before the Industrial Revolution, when socialism that he's imagining enables us to practice our abilities to our fullest and to build our world that way. So The News from Nowhere is a good place if you want to take a look at one that's still relevant from William Morris. Now, humanists have often been progressives. That is, they've often been inclined towards this sort of utopian thinking, at least in previous generations. Um, Auguste Comte is one that I want to focus on. Auguste Comte was born in 1798, so quite a while ago, died in 1857. He's known as the first sociologist. He was a scientist who was sort of studying the world, and sociology, the groups of people and the way that societies behaved, was thought to be too difficult, too complex, that there was no way to study it scientifically. People could do physics, people had started to do psychology, but the idea that we'd be able to study group and group behavior, a lot of people didn't think that could be done scientifically. And Comte is the first one to try to develop methods to do that and build the modern discipline of sociology. To do this, he came up with an idea of, humans having moved through three different stages. The first stage he called the theological stage. What that amounted to was people basically just believing things without questioning, without doubting. They get told stories about, gods and goddesses. They get given religion, and they just follow that. They just believe it. It's just what they do. The metaphysical stage, which is the second stage of his account, involves questioning and reasoning and being skeptical. So he calls it metaphysical because they make these grand assertions about rights that go across all cultures and all histories, right? So we develop a list of human rights that every human has. So he thinks that's sort of metaphysical, but it's developed out of questioning and reasoning and skepticism. Now, of course, we could quibble with a lot of his stages. He's making very broad claims, but the third stage to me is where it gets interesting, and it's what his philosophy was known for, and that is called the positive stage. So he's the creator of positivism. The positive stage tried to take the gist of the more questioning, skeptical, cynical, metaphysical stage and convert it into something more specific and positive. So what did that look like? Well, he'd looked around the world and he'd seen all the different religions people had developed and all of the kinds of superstitions, as far as he was concerned, that had developed around those religions. People just believing all of these other things. When skepticism comes in, it tears it all down, but it doesn't rebuild a basis for it. So he created what he calls the religion of humanity. So he's going to create a new religion, right? He's going to say, we're going to start out, we're going to look at this, and the goal of this religion is to promote humanity. This might be familiar. To do this, he went through and reformed various churches. So he created the Church of Humanity, and they had buildings and locations that people would go to. They wanted to rationalize everything, so they reformed the calendar. So it was no longer where, months were uneven number of days, where you had to have leap years now and then. Like, they tried to deal with all of these kinds of problems. They wanted to not just use the decimal system, or the metric system across for weights and measures and distances. They also wanted to use it for time. So you'd have 100-second minute, 100-minute hour. They were going to lay this out, the whole thing. Many parts of that fell apart, but one part that stuck was that the core of the religion of humanity was that we should live for others, and that it was going to create a culture of people going to these religion of humanity churches and learning to think and bend their attitudes so that they would live for others, so that they would support others. And he used that phrase in French, and it ends up being the root of our word altruism that we use today. So it got so far out there that it created a word, altruism, that becomes part of it. Now, the goal of living for others here was to overcome these local limitations, overcome French people being sympathetic only with French people, or even Parisians only with Parisians, and to say we need to extend our sympathies and our ideas to others, a broad human sentiment that we're going to support the entire set of humanity with this religion, not just our co-religionists or people that subscribe to this narrower thing. And they knew there would be practices, like you'd have to do this, you'd have to go regularly, you'd have to be part of it. Okay, so the religion of humanity. Now, this might sound like an artifact of history to us, something that had died, because it never really caught on in the US, although several intellectuals did buy into it. It did catch on in Latin America. So at the time, there were lots of efforts in Latin America, sort of shifting powers between the colonial powers, and starting to be the elements of throwing off colonialism and revolution and so on. So they were importing these European ideas, among them this religion of humanity being part of it. So there's still today followers of the religion of humanity in Brazil and many other places in Latin America. Mexico's motto is drawn from Comte's thought about the religion of humanity. So still to this day, Mexico officially reflects this kind of thinking. Which will be surprising given how Catholic, right, the rest of Latin America is, that this humanist religion also has a strong basis. Talk a little bit more about why that is in a minute, but I wanted to switch to talk about somebody else who responds to Comte's thought, and that's W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was born in 1868. He died in 1963, which is something to think about, right? 1963, his lifespan overlaps with some of our lifespans. But so he never met Comte, but his ideas were a significant part of what Du Bois studied when he went to Berlin and Harvard. For those who don't know, he was an African-American, or as he would have called himself, a Negro, as he was committed to. He studied with some of the best minds and was supported by some of the best minds in America. William James taught him philosophy, and so he was engaged in those areas. Sociology that he ultimately ended up to study. Comte was highly influential of the various teachers that he picked it up from. So he was steeped in these ideas. And he was impressed, but hesitant. He was afraid that if we took this kind of thinking that Comte pushed, this kind of altruism that Comte pushed, that we'd miss something important. So he points out in his critique, utopia, that word actually means nowhere, right? If we wanted to talk about utopia, it is in no place. So it's a tendency to imagine the future, not from a particular location or talking about a particular history or a particular group of people, but to erase all of that, right? And just kind of start over. Let's talk about nowhere. So I remember William Morris, right? He calls his book The News from Nowhere. This is going to account for this society that doesn't exist and that there isn't a clear line for, you know, how we get there from here, how we move from here. And Du Bois is worried about this tendency to erase some of these local differences, some of these specific differences. The effect in Latin America, one of the reasons that it caught on, is that this was useful for the people who wanted to colonize certain areas. Indigenous people, right, could be brought into this utopia, right, and have their local specific histories, religions, languages, right, erased. So it was useful for some people to use in that way. Although Comte emphasized altruism, later versions, particularly in Mexico, downplayed that part, but did play strongly on this more global tendency, which allowed the wealthy in Mexico to essentially become global capitalists and exploit the poor people in Mexico. So they held on to these ideas up until the revolution that created the country of Mexico, and because it was useful to them. And so Du Bois could see the danger in this kind of utopian thinking by pretending to be from nowhere, by erasing local differences. It, in this case, right, gave power to the elite. Du Bois' particular concern dealt with what he called the Negro in the United States. He was drawn to an idea of Hegel's that every race on the planet had a message that it was developing, an idea that was driving its thought. This comes from its experiences and so on. And so you'd see the experiences in Europe driving certain kinds of ideas and the experiences in China driving certain kinds of ideas. Hegel, being a typical sort of racist European, thought that there was no driving idea coming out of Africa. And Du Bois disagreed with that, obviously. he was somewhat torn between Africa and the United States, but he thought that the Negro had a special message for the whole. I think when put that way, it can sound a little fuzzy to me. It sounds a little strange. But if we think about it, all it's really saying, right, is that the American Negro had a very particular sort of experience, particular struggles that they faced, particular difficulties that they were embedded in, particular cultures that they were responding to. And that generated the ideas, right, that they would have. The literature that they would have, the arguments that they would have, the values that they would like, all of this stuff could be generated out of their particular experience. Now, the claim that that would be a message for the whole has got sort of two parts to it. On one hand, it is a particular message. This is their experience and their location. On the other hand, the experience and the ideas were valuable for the whole, for all races to pay attention to learn from, to draw from. So what does that mean practically? It means, say, right, reading African American philosophy, looking at African American ideas, whether or not you are African American, you can draw from that sort of message, like what they're saying in those contexts. So Du Bois was skeptical of utopian thinking precisely because it tended to erase these histories, these particularities, and particularly that it would erase, in his view, the message of the Negro before that message had been heard. Now, this did not prevent Du Bois from imagining a better world. Right, he was capable of thinking about many ways that the U.S. could be better. Famously, right, if you know anything about sort of this area of history, it's the debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about how to move Negroes forward. That was essentially what they were talking about. Washington wanted to compromise more and talked about personal uplift, whereas Du Bois wanted to reform society and reshape the way that we interacted. So he wanted to deal with a bigger picture. So it didn't stop him from thinking bigger, just because he rejected at least elements of this utopian thinking, of this view from nowhere. All right, so what lessons can we take from this little sort of random sampling of a couple of different pieces of utopian thinking? One thing I take from Du Bois is that we risk projection when we engage in utopian thinking. That is, our personal limited ideas get thrown out in the future as though they are eternal needs that humans will always have. If you've ever traveled to a developing nation and met poor people there and look at their environments, they can live in 1- and 2-room houses, but you talk to them about what they dream about, and they dream about adding a 3rd or 4th room. They dream about maybe getting a toilet. They dream not about living in the American suburbs, not about becoming fabulously wealthy, not even necessarily about revolution. They dream about getting a little bit better about where they are. Well, that truth applies to us as well, right? When we think about what we would need, it's usually just a little bit more of what we already have. So we just project sort of our current character, our current ideas into the future, like we're going to win the lottery, right? But just be able to do more of the same thing. So there's a risk of projection in that way. There's another risk. Growth comes from engaging real people and not just our imaginations, right? We need to encounter the ideas that other people have lodged in their experience. Du Bois suggesting that there's one Black experience has come under a great deal of challenge in the future to say there are multiple different kinds of experiences that you could talk about, that you could appeal to. So engaging with real people lets you start to get those different ideas, those different histories, to connect in those ways. Whereas beginning with sort of this view from nowhere, looking at human beings and only human beings, you miss those particularities, those specific histories, those details. Utopian thinking also, though, has some virtues, some things that are good that it can help with. Can help us learn to look at ourselves in a different light. Nietzsche famously said, right, we need art lest we perish from the truth. Sounds really, really glamorous. But the idea here, right, is that the truth is fixed and it's narrow and it doesn't require this sort of imagination. Whereas utopia means that we stop being constrained by what we think is possible or what we think is likely, or predictions that we might make based on all the statistics and the facts, and we just kind of dream, right, about what it would be like to live differently, to have a different kind of society, to be related to each other and deal with each other in different ways. And that process of imagining that future without asking ourselves exactly how we're going to get there or exactly what's possible, just imagining that future, just dreaming for a little bit, can actually open up and make something possible that wasn't possible before, can make us realize, more accurately, right, make us realize that we were treating some things as fixed and unchangeable. We weren't questioning them. We weren't willing to dream of a world without them. So utopia can be a valuable way for us to start to see ourselves with a different identity, to see ourselves in a different world where we have different relationships with people, different ways of thinking about ourselves. And that can really help us come back to this world, these particular histories, and think about what we can do here to change some of those. So it's always a project. Utopia is always a project of slowly growing outward, beyond ourselves, beyond our community's way of constructing the world, and trying to get just a little bit farther out there in a broader, bigger vision than the one that has been handed to us already. So one of the things we might talk about today is different kinds of utopias that we could dream about, different locations. If any of you know places where utopian thinking is happening, I'd love to hear about it. I don't hear about very much of it. I tried to think about it. So yeah, I think that's something that we can talk about. Let me stop the recording.